What Harry Truman did is he read books. And he, at one time, he said he read every book in the Independence Library. And his favorite was history and biography. So he not only knew who Cyrus was from the biblical side, but he also knew who Cyrus was from the historical side. And where it comes into this picture is that Truman was vitally important in the UN vote in 1947. What had happened is there was all kinds of pressure on Truman. There was pressure from the State Department, who did not want Israel to be recognized. The reason was that they were concerned about possible World War III with the Soviet Union, and they wanted to cuddle up with the Arabs and get Arab oil in case there was a war. And so they said, you don't want to make the Arabs mad, don't recognize Israel. And then he, of course, received pressure from the Arabs themselves, especially Ibn Saud, who was the king of Saudi Arabia, the founder and king of Saudi Arabia, who said, you know, if you do this, then we're not going to give you our oil. Well, Harry Truman knew that they wanted to sell oil, and so he wasn't too afraid of that, and he ended up being totally right, as we know historically. But then the third place where he was getting a lot of pressure was from the Jews and the Zionists. And unfortunately, a couple of the Zionist leaders were rude to him because of their frustration with what was going on. You know, think about it historically. They had just lost 6 million of their brethren in the Holocaust, and 1.5 million of the survivors were still in the concentration camps. We forget about that. They languished there for years in the same prison camps where their brothers and sisters had been killed. And so there was a lot of frustration and a lot of pressure. And finally, Harry Truman said, enough. And he slammed the doors of the White House shut and said, I'm not talking to anybody. Well, the Zionists started to panic because the vote was coming up in the UN on whether or not they would vote for Israel to be a nation again. And they didn't know how Truman was going to vote. And so suddenly someone remembered, oh, Harry Truman has his best friend's a Jewish guy. And they had started a men's clothing store together. Let's call him. Maybe he can get in. And sure enough, he could. And so his name was Eddie Jacobson. And he got in, talked to Harry Truman. Truman said, I don't want to talk to you about this, Eddie. And was for the first time, he gave Eddie the cold shoulder. And he actually started to weep there sitting in the Oval Office. And he thought, what am I going to say? And finally, he saw a statue of Andrew Jackson over on the table. And he said, you know, Harry, all our lives you told me about your hero, Andrew Jackson. He said, do you know who my hero is? And Truman was like, no, who's your hero? And Eddie Jacobson said, my hero is Chaim Weizmann. And Chaim Weizmann was the Ben Franklin of the Zionist movement. He was the one who convinced the British to give the Balfour Declaration during World War I. And he said, Chaim Weizmann is an old man, he's sick, he's almost blind, and he's come all the way to America to talk to you, and you won't talk to him because somebody else was rude to you? That doesn't sound like you, Harry. I thought you could take the heat in this place. And so Truman turned around, looked out over the White House lawn, tapped his finger on the desk, and then finally turned back and said, okay, set up the meeting. You bleepity, bleepity, bleep. And so they set up the meeting, and they snuck Weizmann into the White House because they didn't want the press to see. And it was in that meeting, Harry Truman later said it was in that meeting that he made his decision to support Israel. And so a year after that, and by the way, he told the people in the UN, you make this happen. And so they went to all these different nations and said, you're going to vote with us. If you don't, you're going to pay the consequences. So they put the heat on. Yeah. And the vote went in favor, as we know, for the Jews. So a year after Israel became a nation, the chief rabbi of Israel came to the White House and spoke with Harry Truman. And Harry said, do you know what I did in the rebirth of Israel? And this guy's name was Rabbi Herzog. And he said, yes. He said, you were born for this time, just as Cyrus of old. And just as Cyrus of old did what he did to help the Jews and was remembered, you will always be remembered for what you did to help the nation of Israel. And you are a modern-day Cyrus. So fast forward to 1953, Truman gets out of the White House and is invited to speak in New York City at the Jewish seminary. And Eddie Jacobson, his friend, introduces him and said, here's President Truman who helped with the rebirth of Israel. Everybody clapped. And after they all stopped clapping, Harry stood up and he said to Eddie, what do you mean helped create? He said, I am Cyrus. I am Cyrus. And so that's why I named the book, I Am Cyrus.